48 hours inside Millhaven Institution. Canada's most secure prison. The fortress on Lake Ontario. It was built to hold the men Canada could not control. Not suspects. Not defendants. But people already convicted, already labeled dangerous, already considered a risk to everyone around them. Millhaven Institution. According to Correctional Service of Canada records, Millhaven is one of the country's highest security federal prisons, designed to confine inmates classified as maximum security. Men assessed as escape risks. Men with long histories of violence. Men other prisons could not safely manage. From the outside, it looks quiet. Almost peaceful. A low-lying complex of concrete and steel sits near the shoreline of Lake Ontario in Bath, Ontario, just west of Kingston. The water is calm. The surrounding land is flat. No dramatic towers. No razor-wire skyline like in the movies. And that is the first lie. Because behind those walls is one of the most controlled, surveilled, and psychologically intense environments in the Canadian correctional system. And once you go in, you don't move freely again. Not for 48 hours. Not for 48 months. And for some, not ever. According to public records, Millhaven opened in 1971, during a period when Canada's federal prison system was under intense scrutiny. Riots, escapes, and assaults inside older institutions, especially Kingston Penitentiary, forced officials to rethink how they housed the most violent offenders. Millhaven was part of that answer. It wasn't designed for rehabilitation first. It was designed for containment. From the start, the prison had a reputation. Correctional officers referred to it as the end of the line. Inmates called it the warehouse. Because Millhaven didn't just hold criminals. It held the men other prisons couldn't survive. According to CSC documentation and investigative reporting, Millhaven later became home to Canada's Special Handling Unit, the SHU, a facility within a facility meant for the most disruptive and dangerous inmates in the federal system. Prisoners placed there were isolated for long periods, under conditions stricter than standard maximum security. The SHU existed for over 2 decades. And it changed everything. But before we get there, you need to understand what it feels like to enter Millhaven. Because the first 48 hours are not about punishment. They are about breaking orientation. The road into Millhaven is deliberately unremarkable. No signage advertising danger. No warnings telling you to turn back. Just a security gate, reinforced fencing, and a controlled entrance that forces every vehicle to stop, identify, and submit. According to former correctional staff interviews and public testimony, nothing enters Millhaven without being logged. Not people. Not paper. Not food. Not air systems. Surveillance begins before the gate opens. Cameras track approach angles. Mirrors eliminate blind spots. Radio traffic confirms identities before anyone steps inside. For inmates arriving by transport van, the process starts before the engine shuts off. Hands visible. Heads forward. No talking. The doors open inward. That detail matters. Because inward opening doors mean pressure from the inside cannot force them open. Inside the sally port, the first strip search occurs. Not aggressive. Not rushed. Clinical. According to policy manuals made public through court filings, incoming inmates are searched multiple times during intake. Clothing removed. Body checked. Mouth inspected. Hair examined. Anything out of place delays the process. And delay is dangerous. Because the longer a transfer takes, the more unpredictable it becomes. Once cleared, inmates are issued institutional clothing. Standardized. Color-coded. No individuality. From this moment on, you are not dressed as a person. You are dressed as a classification. Then comes orientation. A brief explanation of rules delivered without emotion. Where you can walk. When you can speak. What happens if you refuse an order? According to CSC procedures, refusal is logged. Repeated refusal escalates security level. At Millhaven, escalation happens fast. The first 48 hours are not spent in general population. They are spent under observation. Every movement recorded. Every reaction noted. Every interaction evaluated. Because Millhaven doesn't assume you are stable. It assumes the opposite. Inside the living units, architecture replaces intimidation. The ceilings are high but claustrophobic. The lighting is constant, never fully dark. The sound carries. Metal doors amplify footsteps. Voices echo longer than expected. Silence becomes noticeable. Former inmates have described Millhaven as a place where you always feel watched, even when no one is visible. According to multiple news interviews conducted over decades, that sense is intentional. Because unpredictability is controlled through pressure. Cells are sparse. A bed fixed to the floor. A toilet sink combination bolted to the wall. A narrow shelf. No loose objects. No privacy. And according to publicly available correctional standards, inmates can be confined to their cells for up to 23 hours a day depending on classification, staffing levels, and institutional lockdowns. Millhaven has seen many lockdowns. Some planned. Some sudden. Because violence doesn't announce itself. The reputation of Millhaven didn't come from rumor. It came from events. In the 1970s and 1980s, according to archived news reports from Canadian outlets, the prison experienced disturbances, hostage situations, and prolonged lockdowns. These incidents were not always widely publicized at the time, but court records and later investigations confirmed their severity. Inmates barricaded themselves. Staff were injured. Negotiators were called. And each incident hardened the institution. Security tightened. Movement restricted. Trust eliminated. By the time the Special Handling Unit was fully operational inside Millhaven, the prison had become something else entirely. The SHU was not a privilege. It was a last resort. According to CSC descriptions, inmates placed in the SHU were those who posed a serious threat to the safety of staff, other inmates, or the security of the institution. Translation: men who attacked guards, organized violence, or repeatedly disrupted operations. Life inside the SHU was isolation layered on isolation. Cells within reinforced ranges. Limited human contact. Constant monitoring. Some inmates spent years there. That fact would later become the subject of legal challenges, human rights complaints, and national debate. But during the period we are focusing on, the SHU was considered necessary. Essential. Unavoidable. To understand Millhaven, you need to understand the psychology of control. This is not a place designed to inspire change. It is designed to prevent chaos. According to correctional experts quoted in investigative journalism, maximum security prisons operate on a simple principle: predictability reduces violence. Schedules are rigid. Meals at fixed times. Exercise at controlled intervals. Movement in single-file lines. Every deviation is logged. Every interaction documented. And in a place like Millhaven, documentation is survival. For staff and inmates alike. Correctional officers do not work alone. They move in pairs or teams. They communicate constantly. They rely on procedure, not instinct. Because instinct can be exploited. Inmates test boundaries. Not immediately. Not loudly. They watch first. Who hesitates? Who speaks softly? Who avoids eye contact? According to former guards who spoke anonymously to journalists, the first 48 hours after a new inmate arrives are critical. That is when alliances form. That is when tensions surface. That is when mistakes happen. And Millhaven has very little tolerance for mistakes. Despite its reputation, Millhaven is not chaos. It is order taken to an extreme. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because when control slips, it slips violently. Over the decades, there have been documented assaults, suicides, and long-term psychological harm associated with prolonged isolation, according to court filings and government reports. These outcomes led to national discussions about segregation practices in Canada's federal prisons. Millhaven was often cited. Not because it was unique, but because it was extreme. As night falls inside the institution, nothing changes. Lights remain on at reduced intensity. Cameras continue recording. Doors remain locked. Sleep comes in fragments. According to inmate accounts reported in the media, the sounds never stop. Keys. Radios. Metal on metal. Every noise reminds you where you are. And why. The first 48 hours inside Millhaven are not about serving a sentence. They are about learning the environment. Learning when to speak. Learning when to stay silent. Learning who controls what. Because Millhaven does not reward defiance. It documents it. And documentation follows you. Through reviews. Through parole hearings. Through transfers. Inside these walls, reputation becomes currency. And once earned, it is nearly impossible to erase. In the next chapter, we move deeper inside Millhaven's most restricted spaces. We examine how control is enforced when rules fail. And we look at the incidents, verified, documented, and investigated. That turned Millhaven from a prison into a symbol. A symbol of how far a system will go when it believes safety depends on absolute control. Control fails quietly. Millhaven does not explode into violence. It erodes into it. That is the detail most people miss. According to investigative reporting and Correctional Service of Canada reviews, serious incidents inside maximum security institutions rarely begin with chaos. They begin with small changes. Slight delays. Unusual silences. Routines that stop lining up the way they should. At Millhaven, control is everything. So when control weakens, even briefly, the consequences are severe. Inside the prison, the second day is harder than the first. The first day is shock. The second day is realization. Because by then, the rules are no longer theoretical. They are enforced. Morning inside Millhaven begins before sunrise. Lights increase to full brightness on a fixed schedule. Doors do not open. Inmates wake inside locked cells, aware that movement will be permitted only when the institution decides. According to CSC operational manuals made public through access to information requests, head counts occur multiple times daily. Visual confirmation is mandatory. Failure to respond results in immediate escalation. There is no margin for ambiguity. If a body is not visible, the assumption is danger. And danger inside Millhaven is not negotiated. Breakfast is not a social event. Food is delivered through controlled movement or slot systems depending on security level. Conversations are limited. Eye contact is monitored. Every interaction is observed. This is not about cruelty. It is about predictability. But predictability has a flaw. It teaches people how the system works. And some inmates arrive already knowing that. According to court filings and academic studies on prison subcultures, long-term federal offenders are often experts in institutional behavior. They understand schedules. They understand staffing patterns. They understand which rules matter and which ones can be bent. Millhaven attracts those men. Not because they choose it. Because other prisons cannot hold them. Inside the Special Handling Unit, control is even tighter. The SHU was physically separated from the rest of the institution. Reinforced ranges. Limited movement. Single-cell confinement. According to CSC descriptions and human rights reports, inmates in the SHU were often confined alone for extended periods, sometimes months or years, with limited access to programs or social interaction. The official justification was safety. And in many cases, that justification was supported by evidence. Some inmates had assaulted staff. Some had organized gang activity. Some had led riots. Millhaven was the response. But isolation changes people. That is not speculation. That is documented. Multiple court cases, including challenges brought by civil liberties organizations, later argued that prolonged segregation caused psychological harm. Symptoms included anxiety, paranoia, depression, and emotional instability. At the time, however, the focus inside Millhaven was not long-term outcomes. It was immediate control. On the second day, inmates begin to test the system. Not with violence. With behavior. A refusal to comply quickly enough. A delayed response to an order. A stare held too long. According to former correctional officers interviewed by Canadian media, these moments are critical. Staff must respond consistently. Any perceived weakness spreads. Because inmates watch everything. And inside a place like Millhaven, perception is reality. There is a moment every inmate experiences. It happens when they realize no one is coming to rescue them. No judge. No appeal. No outside intervention. Whatever happens inside these walls will be handled internally. That realization produces two reactions. Submission. Or resistance. And resistance at Millhaven has a long history. In the late 1970s and 1980s, Millhaven was repeatedly cited in media reports for serious disturbances. Some incidents involved coordinated inmate action. Others began as isolated confrontations that escalated. One of the most significant disturbances occurred when inmates barricaded themselves, according to archived newspaper accounts and later official reviews. Negotiations lasted hours. Emergency response teams were deployed. Injuries were reported. Details vary by source. Some accounts emphasize inmate grievances over conditions. Others highlight security failures and staffing shortages. What is consistent is the outcome. After every major incident, Millhaven became more restrictive. More cameras. Less movement. Stricter segregation. The prison learned the same lesson repeatedly. Control must increase. By the time the SHU was fully operational, Millhaven had effectively become two prisons. The general population ranges. And the inner core. Movement between them was rare. And for inmates transferred into the SHU, the message was clear. This is where resistance ends. But resistance does not disappear. It adapts. According to criminologists and correctional experts, isolation environments often intensify internal conflict. Without social outlets, tension turns inward or explodes unpredictably. Self-harm incidents increased. Mental health crises became more frequent. Staff stress rose. These facts appear in internal CSC reviews and were later referenced in court proceedings. Yet day to day, officers still had a job to do. Maintain order. Prevent harm. Go home alive. On the second night, sleep becomes difficult. Not because of noise. Because of anticipation. Inmates learn the rhythms of the prison quickly. They know when guards walk past. They know when counts occur. They know how long doors remain locked. And they begin calculating. Not escape. Influence. According to investigative journalists who studied prison power structures, influence inside maximum security prisons often operates through information. Knowing who is transferred. Knowing who is vulnerable. Knowing which officer enforces rules strictly and which one relies on discretion. Millhaven attempts to neutralize that. Staff rotations change. Schedules vary. Procedures are rigid. But humans still run the system. And humans make patterns. It is during these quiet hours that the most dangerous decisions are made. Not loud ones. Internal ones. According to inmate testimonies reported years later, some men decided early on that survival meant invisibility. Others decided it meant reputation. At Millhaven, reputation can protect or destroy you. If you are seen as compliant, you may be targeted. If you are seen as aggressive, you may be isolated further. There is no safe identity. For correctional staff, the second day brings fatigue. Maximum security work is mentally exhausting. Every interaction carries risk. Every routine task can turn violent. According to workplace safety reports and union statements, officers at Millhaven faced high stress levels, increased injury rates, and long-term psychological strain. They were not dealing with petty offenders. They were dealing with men who had nothing to lose. At some point during the second day, most inmates witness discipline. Not directed at them. At someone else. A door opens. Orders are issued. Compliance is demanded. If compliance does not come immediately, force follows. This is not brutality. It is procedure. According to CSC use of force policies, officers are authorized to use escalating force when necessary to maintain safety and order. Every incident is reviewed. Every action documented. But documentation does not erase impact. Watching force used reinforces the hierarchy. This is who controls movement. This is who decides consequences. And inside Millhaven, consequences are absolute. The SHU amplifies this dynamic. Inmates there experience force as the only form of interaction. Meals delivered through slots. Exercise alone. Showers scheduled and supervised. According to human rights observers, this level of isolation can distort perception. Time loses meaning. Small events feel enormous. That distortion contributes to instability. Which then justifies continued isolation. A cycle forms. Millhaven's critics later argued that the institution became a feedback loop of control and resistance. The more control was applied, the more resistance emerged, which then justified even harsher control. Supporters argued the opposite. That Millhaven prevented violence elsewhere. That the SHU contained threats that would otherwise endanger lives. Both claims appear in official records. And both can be true. By the end of the second day, inmates understand something crucial. Millhaven is not trying to fix them. It is trying to manage them. That distinction matters. Because management prioritizes stability over change. And stability sometimes requires harm. As the hours pass, rumors circulate. Not wild ones. Institutional ones. Who was transferred in recently? Who is being monitored closely? Who is scheduled for review? According to correctional research, information scarcity increases rumor accuracy. When communication is limited, small details gain importance. Millhaven thrives on limited information. But inmates still talk. And those conversations shape behavior. Somewhere inside the prison, a file is being updated. Behavior logs. Compliance notes. Risk assessments. These documents follow inmates for years. They influence parole decisions. They justify segregation. They explain transfers. The first 48 hours generate a disproportionate amount of data. Because first impressions matter. Even inside prison. By the end of the second night, exhaustion sets in. For everyone. Inmates retreat into silence or agitation. Officers rely on muscle memory. The institution remains intact. But the pressure is building. Because Millhaven has a history of calm before rupture. In the next chapter, we move to the moments when control finally breaks. The incidents documented in court filings and investigative reports. The standoffs. The lockdowns. The decisions that left permanent marks on the prison and the people inside it. When the system breaks. Millhaven does not collapse loudly. It fractures in controlled silence. That is what the public rarely sees. According to court filings, internal reviews, and long-form investigative reporting, the most consequential incidents inside Millhaven did not resemble cinematic riots. They unfolded in phases, procedural failures, delayed decisions, accumulated stress, until one moment tipped the balance. By the third day, the pressure is no longer abstract. It is operational. Inside a maximum security prison, every system assumes compliance. Doors assume orders will be followed. Counts assume bodies will appear. Schedules assume cooperation. When any of those assumptions fail, response time matters. At Millhaven, response time is everything. The third day often coincides with review meetings. Behavior assessments. Security briefings. Mental health evaluations. According to CSC procedures referenced in public reports, newly arrived inmates are reviewed early to determine housing placement, security classification, and program eligibility. These reviews are not symbolic. They decide whether an inmate moves toward relative stability or deeper restriction. And for some men, the decision feels final. Historically, several major incidents at Millhaven began around review periods. Not because reviews are dangerous, but because they force confrontation with reality. An inmate learns he is not leaving segregation. Or that his security level will not be reduced. Or that mental health recommendations will not change housing status. That knowledge can destabilize even experienced offenders. One documented disturbance involved coordinated refusal. According to archived news coverage and later official summaries, a group of inmates refused to comply with movement orders. Doors remained closed. Communication ceased. This was not spontaneous violence. It was strategic noncompliance. Correctional officers responded by locking down affected ranges. Lockdown is the prison's emergency brake. Movement stops. Programs cancel. The institution narrows its focus to containment. Lockdowns are expensive. They strain staff. They disrupt routines. They escalate tension. Which is why administrators try to resolve situations quickly. But speed carries risk. Negotiation is part of prison management. This surprises people. According to correctional experts, dialogue prevents escalation. Orders are repeated. Time is allowed. Faces are saved. But negotiation has limits. At Millhaven, those limits are enforced strictly. In one well-documented case referenced in multiple reports, negotiations failed. Inmates fortified positions using furniture and fixtures. Access points were blocked. Visibility was reduced. Emergency response teams were activated. These teams are trained for one purpose: control restoration. According to CSC descriptions, emergency teams use protective equipment, shields, and coordinated movement to retake areas when standard procedures fail. The use of force is regulated, reviewed, justified afterward in reports. But during the moment, it is decisive. The aftermath matters more than the incident itself. After every major disturbance, Millhaven changed. Physical modifications followed. Procedural updates were issued. Staff training intensified. Each change aimed to prevent recurrence. And each change reduced flexibility. One of the most controversial aspects of Millhaven's history centers on prolonged segregation. According to court records and human rights findings, inmates spent extended periods in isolation, sometimes years, particularly within the Special Handling Unit. These conditions became the focus of legal challenges. Plaintiffs argued that prolonged isolation caused psychological harm and violated constitutional protections. The government argued necessity. Public safety required extreme measures. Courts reviewed evidence. Medical experts testified. Correctional officials testified. Former inmates testified. The debate was not abstract. It was documented. Several court decisions acknowledged harm while still recognizing the challenges of managing violent offenders. The result was reform. The Special Handling Unit was eventually closed. Millhaven's role changed. But during the period we are documenting, the SHU represented the apex of control. And control always invites resistance. Another documented incident involved an assault on staff. Details are limited in public sources to protect identities. What is confirmed is that an officer was injured, and emergency procedures were triggered. The institution locked down. External support was mobilized. The response was swift. And the consequences were permanent. Inmates involved were transferred. Charges were laid where applicable. Security protocols tightened. Each incident reinforced the same conclusion. Millhaven existed because other options failed. Violence inside prisons is not random. According to criminological research cited in government reports, it often follows patterns: perceived injustice, loss of status, mental health crises, or power struggles. Millhaven contained all of those factors. High-risk inmates. Rigid control. Limited outlets. That combination is unstable by nature. By the third day, inmates know where they stand. They have seen force used. They have felt isolation. They understand consequences. Some adapt. Others escalate. Correctional staff face their own breaking points. According to union statements and workplace studies, prolonged exposure to high-risk environments increases burnout, hypervigilance, and decision fatigue. At Millhaven, officers work in constant readiness. There is no safe shift. Every day carries potential for escalation. One internal review noted that staff shortages during certain periods increased risk. Fewer officers meant less flexibility. Less flexibility meant harsher enforcement. Harsher enforcement increased resistance. The system tightened itself. Despite its reputation, Millhaven also prevented incidents. This is often overlooked. According to CSC statistics, the concentration of high-risk inmates in one facility reduced violence in others. Millhaven absorbed danger. It functioned as a pressure valve for the system. But pressure valves still wear out. By the end of the third day, tension peaks. Not because something is happening. Because something could. Every interaction carries weight. A delayed response can trigger force. A misinterpreted look can escalate conflict. This is the reality of maximum security incarceration. Outside the walls, the public remains largely unaware. Millhaven does not advertise incidents. Information emerges slowly. Through court filings. Through investigative journalism. Through inquiries years later. The prison's true history is pieced together after the fact. As reforms began to reshape Canada's correctional system, Millhaven became a case study. In balance. In excess. In consequence. The institution demonstrated both the necessity and the cost of extreme control. In the final chapter, we examine what remains. The legacy of Millhaven. The lessons drawn from its most intense years. And the unanswered question at the heart of it all. Can absolute control ever produce safety without damage? The cost of absolute control. Millhaven still stands. The walls are still there. The gates still close. The cameras still watch. But the institution that exists today is not the one that defined Canada's correctional debates for decades. And that difference matters. Because Millhaven's legacy is not just about what happened inside its walls. It is about what those events forced an entire country to confront. By the early 2000s, scrutiny of Canada's maximum security prisons intensified. Not because violence had disappeared, but because evidence accumulated. According to court filings, ombudsman reports, and federal inquiries, prolonged segregation, especially in places like Millhaven, was producing measurable harm. Psychiatrists documented symptoms. Former inmates described cognitive decline. Correctional officers reported escalating behavioral instability. Internal reports acknowledged increased self-harm risks. This was no longer anecdotal. It was institutional. Millhaven became central to that conversation because of the Special Handling Unit. The SHU was never intended to be permanent. It was described in CSC documents as a temporary measure for inmates who posed extraordinary risk. But temporary became prolonged. And prolonged became normalized. According to publicly available data, some inmates spent years in near-total isolation, interacting with staff through slots in reinforced doors, exercising alone, and experiencing minimal human contact. Courts were asked to decide whether safety justified that cost. Legal challenges did not deny the danger posed by certain inmates. Instead, they questioned the method. Was indefinite isolation the only option? Did it reduce violence or simply delay it? Did it protect staff or erode institutional stability? These questions appeared repeatedly in judicial opinions and parliamentary discussions. And Millhaven was always in the background. One of the most significant shifts came when courts acknowledged that prolonged segregation could violate constitutional protections if not strictly limited and reviewed. This did not mean segregation ended. It meant oversight increased. Time limits were imposed. Reviews became mandatory. Mental health input gained weight. Eventually, the Special Handling Unit was closed. Millhaven's role changed. That closure did not erase the past. It reframed it. The prison went from being a symbol of containment to a case study in consequence. Former inmates who passed through Millhaven during its most restrictive era have spoken publicly in later years, often through journalists or legal filings. Their accounts vary. Some describe Millhaven as brutal but necessary. Others describe it as psychologically destructive. Many describe both. What is consistent is the acknowledgement that time inside Millhaven left marks that did not fade easily. Correctional officers tell a parallel story. In interviews and union reports, many described pride in maintaining safety under extreme conditions. They prevented escapes. They stopped riots. They protected lives. But they also described burnout. Hypervigilance. Nightmares. Long-term stress injuries. The cost of control was paid by everyone. Millhaven's history forces an uncomfortable truth. There is no clean solution to extreme violence. Every option has consequences. Leniency can invite chaos. Control can produce harm. Isolation can stabilize and destabilize at the same time. The prison system exists in that contradiction. Canada's correctional reforms did not dismantle maximum security incarceration. They refined it. Segregation remains. High-risk units still exist. Violence is still managed. But the language changed. From punishment to risk management. From isolation to structured intervention. From secrecy to review. Millhaven helped drive that change. Today, when policymakers discuss prison reform, Millhaven appears in footnotes and references. Not always by name. But by implication. It represents the outer limit of control. The point where safety and humanity collide. Inside the prison now, routines continue. Counts still happen. Doors still lock. Orders are still enforced. But there is more oversight. More documentation. More external review. The fortress adapted. And yet, the central question remains unresolved. What do you do with people who cannot coexist safely with others? Millhaven was one answer. Not a perfect one. But a revealing one. The first 48 hours inside Millhaven were designed to orient behavior. To teach rules. To establish hierarchy. To signal consequence. What followed over years was a deeper lesson. That control without exit strategies creates stagnation. That containment without rehabilitation becomes permanent. That safety achieved through isolation accumulates hidden costs. Millhaven's story is not a warning against prisons. It is a warning against absolutes. Absolute control. Absolute isolation. Absolute certainty. Those ideas feel comforting in the face of danger. But history shows they rarely remain contained. For the men who lived inside Millhaven during its most restrictive years, the prison became a defining chapter. For the officers who worked there, it became a professional crucible. For Canada, it became a mirror. Reflecting what happens when fear, safety, and power intersect. The walls did their job. They held people in. But they also held questions that could not be ignored. Questions about dignity. About limits. About responsibility. Millhaven did not fail because it was harsh. It was harsh because the system believed it had no alternative. What changed was not the threat. What changed was the willingness to confront the cost. Today, Millhaven is quieter. Not because danger disappeared. But because the system learned, slowly, painfully. That silence achieved through isolation is not the same as safety achieved through balance. And that is the legacy of Millhaven Institution. A place built to contain the uncontrollable. A system pushed to its extremes. And a reminder that even the strongest walls cannot hold consequences forever. After the gates close, Millhaven never truly ends. That is the part no policy paper captures. Because prisons do not disappear when reforms are announced. They don't reset when units are closed. They don't erase memory when names change. They linger. In people. In procedures. In the way the system reacts to fear. And Millhaven lingers more than most. After the closure of the Special Handling Unit, official language shifted. According to Correctional Service of Canada statements and parliamentary records, the focus moved toward structured intervention, dynamic security, and mental health, informed management. On paper, this looked like progress. In practice, it was an admission. The old model had reached its limit. The SHU had been created because the system believed it had no alternative. It was the place of last resort. The endpoint for men who could not be managed anywhere else. When it closed, the question became unavoidable. What happens to the men it was built to contain? There was no simple answer. According to CSC documentation and court records, those inmates were redistributed across other maximum security institutions, placed into newly designed high-security ranges, or managed through individualized risk plans. The system did not become softer. It became more fragmented. This fragmentation created new challenges. Without a single centralized facility like Millhaven's SHU, high-risk inmates were spread across multiple institutions. That increased pressure elsewhere. Staff in other prisons faced behaviors they were not trained for. Infrastructure designed for standard maximum security now housed extreme cases. Incidents followed. This pattern appears in subsequent reports and media coverage. Millhaven had absorbed danger. When it stopped doing that, the danger didn't disappear. It relocated. Critics of the SHU closure warned of this outcome. Supporters acknowledged it but argued the alternative was worse. Both positions appear in public discourse. And both were partially right. Millhaven itself did not become irrelevant. It remained a maximum security institution. But its role changed. From symbolic endpoint to operational facility. That distinction matters. Because symbolism shapes policy. And Millhaven's symbolism had become too heavy to carry. Former inmates who left Millhaven during the transition period described a strange disconnect. The rules had changed. The language had softened. But the environment felt familiar. Doors still locked. Movement still restricted. Authority still absolute. Reform did not mean freedom. It meant moderation. For some inmates, that moderation came too late. Court records include cases where men who spent prolonged periods in isolation later struggled to reintegrate even within prison environments. They had difficulty interacting. They misread social cues. They reacted intensely to minor stressors. These outcomes were cited by psychologists and expert witnesses. The damage was not theoretical. It was observed. Correctional officers experienced a similar aftershock. According to union statements and occupational health studies, staff who worked in extreme control environments often carried those habits with them. Hypervigilance became default. Flexibility felt unsafe. Trust was limited. When policy demanded more discretion, some officers struggled. Not because they opposed reform. But because they had survived an earlier reality. Millhaven had trained them for certainty. The new system asked for judgment. Judgment is harder. In the years that followed, inquiries and reviews repeatedly returned to the same themes. Transparency. Oversight. Balance. Words that sound simple. Words that are not. One independent review noted that secrecy had amplified harm. When incidents occurred inside Millhaven, information moved slowly. Details were withheld. Families learned late. Public understanding lagged. This secrecy was justified as security. But it also prevented accountability. Reforms demanded sunlight. Media access increased. Not full access. But more than before. Journalists were allowed to ask harder questions. Documents were released under access laws. The story of Millhaven became clearer. And more complicated. One recurring question haunted every discussion. Did Millhaven work? The answer depends on how you define success. If success means preventing escapes, the answer is largely yes. If success means containing extreme violence, the answer is mixed. If success means rehabilitation, the answer is unclear. And if success means preserving mental health, the evidence suggests a cost too high to ignore. Millhaven forced Canada to articulate what it expects prisons to do. Punish. Protect. Reform. Contain. The truth is, prisons do all four. But when one goal dominates, the others suffer. Millhaven was built when containment dominated everything else. The consequences followed logically. Even today, when officials speak about lessons learned, Millhaven is rarely named directly. But its fingerprints are everywhere. In policy language. In review mechanisms. In mental health screening protocols. In the insistence that isolation must be justified, limited, and monitored. Yet danger remains. That truth has not changed. There are still inmates who assault staff. Who organize violence. Who cannot be safely housed with others. The system still needs tools to manage them. The debate is not whether control is necessary. It is how much, how long, and at what cost. Millhaven answers the how much question with a warning. Too much control creates its own instability. One of the most sobering aspects of Millhaven's legacy is what cannot be measured. The moments of despair not recorded. The internal breakdowns never diagnosed. The relationships permanently damaged. Statistics capture incidents. They do not capture erosion. For families of inmates, Millhaven represented distance. Not just physical distance. Emotional distance. Visitation was limited. Communication was controlled. Information was scarce. Some families learned about incidents months later. Others learned through court filings. Trust eroded on the outside too. Public trust matters. When prisons operate beyond scrutiny, legitimacy weakens. Millhaven taught that lesson the hard way. And yet, there is another side. There are victims whose names are rarely spoken in reform debates. Victims of crimes committed by inmates who later passed through Millhaven. For them, safety is not abstract. It is personal. Any reduction in control feels like risk. Their voices appear in hearings and submissions. They ask simple questions. What if someone escapes? What if someone is hurt? Who is responsible? Millhaven once answered those questions with certainty. No escape. Maximum containment. Absolute authority. That certainty came at a cost. But uncertainty carries costs too. This is the moral tension at the heart of incarceration. There is no configuration that satisfies everyone. Millhaven was not an anomaly. It was an extreme expression of a universal problem. As years pass, Millhaven's name fades from headlines. New controversies replace old ones. New institutions face new scrutiny. But when historians examine this period, Millhaven will stand out. Not because it was uniquely cruel. But because it was honest about its purpose. Containment above all else. That honesty forced reform. Because when a system is explicit about its priorities, it becomes accountable for their consequences. Millhaven made Canada look at itself. Inside the prison today, younger officers work alongside veterans. The veterans remember the SHU. They remember long lockdowns. They remember silence. They remember force. The younger staff learn a different doctrine. Communication. De-escalation. Mental health awareness. Both groups operate in the same building. That coexistence is not always smooth. Inmates sense this shift. Some exploit it. Some benefit from it. Some distrust it. Trust inside prison is fragile. Millhaven did not create that fragility. But it intensified it. One former administrator, speaking anonymously in a media interview, summarized the problem bluntly. You can't run a prison like a machine forever. People aren't machines. They break. And when they break, the system breaks with them. That statement was not a condemnation. It was an observation. Millhaven's greatest contribution may be this. It proved that extreme control has diminishing returns. At first, it stabilizes. Then it stagnates. Then it destabilizes in new ways. The longer it persists, the higher the cost. That lesson now informs training. Policy. Oversight. But lessons are not guarantees. They must be remembered. Because the conditions that created Millhaven still exist. Violence. Fear. Public demand for safety. In moments of crisis, systems revert to what they know. Millhaven shows where that road leads. The gates close every night. Inside, men sleep under lights that never fully dim. Outside, the public sleeps unaware. Between those worlds lies a responsibility. To protect without destroying. To contain without erasing. To control without forgetting humanity. Millhaven was built to answer fear. What it revealed was something deeper. Fear can build walls. But it cannot decide how long they should stand. That decision belongs to the society that built them. And that is why Millhaven still matters. Not as a prison, but as a question. How far are we willing to go for safety? And what are we willing to lose along the way? The question that never leaves. Millhaven does not end with reform. It ends with a question that refuses to settle. Because when the gates close and the reports are filed, when policies are rewritten and units are renamed, the same dilemma remains. Quiet, unresolved, persistent. What do you do when safety demands control, but control causes harm? That question did not start at Millhaven. But Millhaven forced it into the open. Long after the Special Handling Unit closed, its influence continued shaping decisions across Canada's federal correctional system. Not as a blueprint. As a warning. According to internal policy reviews and expert testimony cited in later inquiries, administrators began asking different questions during crisis moments. Not only, how do we stop this now? But also, what happens next? That shift did not come easily. Because prisons are built for certainty. Rules. Procedures. Clear lines of authority. Questions introduce ambiguity. And ambiguity feels dangerous in environments where seconds matter. Millhaven trained generations of staff to prioritize decisiveness. That training saved lives. But it also narrowed options. When isolation is your strongest tool, everything looks like a justification for isolation. Breaking that mindset required more than policy. It required cultural change. Cultural change inside prisons is slow. According to correctional sociologists, institutional culture is shaped by lived experience, not directives. Officers trust what kept them safe before. Administrators rely on methods that prevented disaster. Millhaven's history meant its shadow extended far beyond its walls. As new intervention units replaced older segregation models, language softened. Structured intervention units. Enhanced monitoring. Clinical engagement. But to inmates, the difference was not always obvious. Doors still locked. Movement still controlled. Authority still absolute. Reform did not eliminate power imbalance. It rebranded it. Former inmates interviewed years later often described confusion. They were told the system had changed. But they still felt watched. Still felt restricted. Still felt expendable. For some, Millhaven became a reference point. This is better than Millhaven, staff would say. But better is relative. For correctional officers, reform brought new pressure. They were now expected to de-escalate more. Engage more. Document more. All while facing the same risks. According to workplace assessments, officers reported feeling caught between policy and reality. If they acted too forcefully, oversight intervened. If they hesitated, safety was threatened. Millhaven had trained them for certainty. The new system demanded balance. Balance is fragile. Especially in institutions built to contain instability. The public perception of Millhaven evolved over time. Early coverage focused on danger. Later coverage focused on rights. Then silence followed. Millhaven faded from headlines. But its influence remained embedded in legislation, training manuals, and case law. When Canada debated limits on solitary confinement, Millhaven was not always named. But the arguments echoed its history. Proponents of limits cited documented psychological harm, many examples originating in facilities like Millhaven. Opponents cited cases involving extreme violence, cases often managed at Millhaven. The debate was never theoretical. It was anchored in lived experience. International observers took notice. Human rights organizations referenced Canada's reforms as partial progress. They acknowledged the difficulty of managing violent offenders. But they continued to warn against prolonged isolation. Millhaven was cited indirectly in comparative studies. A case where necessity collided with ethics. Yet even critics acknowledged a hard truth. There are individuals who cannot safely exist in communal settings. No amount of programming changes that reality. Millhaven existed because of that truth. The failure was not recognizing danger. The failure was believing danger could be neutralized without cost. As years passed, a new generation entered the system. Inmates who never experienced the SHU. Officers who never worked its ranges. Millhaven became history. Stories told during training. Warnings shared informally. Don't let it get that far again. But history has a way of repeating when memory fades. Periodic incidents in other institutions reignited old instincts. Lockdowns extended. Isolation increased. Oversight tightened. Each time, administrators faced the same question. Is this temporary? Or are we rebuilding Millhaven in pieces? This is the danger of institutional memory loss. Not forgetting events. Forgetting lessons. Millhaven taught that safety achieved through extreme control is fragile. It holds until it doesn't. When it fails expensively. The prison also revealed something uncomfortable. Society often demands absolute safety without acknowledging trade-offs. When violence occurs, the response is immediate. Lock them down. Separate them. Do whatever it takes. Millhaven did exactly that. And then asked society to look at the results. That look was not immediate. It took lawsuits. Reports. Whistleblowers. Years of quiet damage. Change came slowly. Because acknowledging harm required admitting complicity. Today, when correctional leaders speak about risk-based approaches, Millhaven sits beneath that phrase. Risk-based means weighing outcomes. Not only immediate safety, but long-term stability. Long-term stability includes mental health. According to correctional psychologists, untreated psychological damage increases future violence. Isolation can suppress behavior temporarily. But it often intensifies it later. Millhaven demonstrated this pattern. Not always. But often enough to matter. Some former inmates left Millhaven angrier. Others left withdrawn. A few described clarity. There is no single outcome. Which complicates reform. For victims of crime, Millhaven represented certainty. A place where the most dangerous people were contained. Any erosion of that certainty feels threatening. Policymakers must answer to them too. Millhaven did that job. The question is whether it did too much of it. In the years following reform, recidivism data was scrutinized. Did reduced isolation increase violence? Did it decrease it? The results were mixed. Because human behavior resists clean metrics. What emerged instead was nuance. Not all isolation is the same. Not all inmates respond the same. Not all risks justify the same response. Millhaven treated danger as uniform. Reality proved otherwise. The final legacy of Millhaven may be methodological. It forced Canada to move from blunt instruments to calibrated responses. That transition is ongoing. And incomplete. Inside prisons today, echoes of Millhaven appear during crisis moments. A door held shut longer than planned. A range isolated beyond review timelines. A decision justified by safety. Each time, someone asks quietly. Are we doing this because it works? Or because it feels safe? That question is Millhaven's final gift. Millhaven also challenges how societies define justice. Is justice containment? Is it prevention? Is it restoration? Millhaven answered with containment. Later reforms tried to expand that answer. But expansion does not erase origins. Even now, the prison remains operational. Staff arrive for shifts. Inmates line up for counts. Life continues. Millhaven is not a ruin. It is a functioning institution. Which makes its lessons harder to dismiss. Because this is not ancient history. It is recent. And relevant. As public attention shifts to other issues, prisons fade into background noise. But they continue shaping outcomes. Every inmate released carries their experience forward. Every officer retires with memory intact. Millhaven lives in those memories. Some remember discipline. Others remember despair. Both are true. If there is one conclusion Millhaven forces, it is this. There is no permanent solution to danger. Only management. And management demands humility. Humility to recognize limits. Humility to review decisions. Humility to change. Millhaven existed at a time when humility was absent. Certainty ruled. That certainty built walls. Strong ones. But walls alone cannot resolve what created the need for them. As long as societies fear violence, places like Millhaven will seem necessary. As long as those places exist, they will test ethical boundaries. The challenge is not eliminating prisons. It is preventing them from becoming answers to questions they cannot solve. Millhaven answered fear with force. What followed was reflection. The question remains. When safety demands control, how much is too much? Millhaven shows what happens when that question is answered too late. And that is why its story does not end. Because every time a door locks behind someone deemed too dangerous, Millhaven is there. Not as a building. But as a reminder. After the silence. When the camera pulls back from Millhaven, nothing dramatic happens. There is no explosion. No final riot. No single moment that explains everything. Just concrete. Steel. And a system that keeps running long after public attention moves on. That is the most unsettling part. Because Millhaven was never about spectacle. It was about decisions made quietly, repeated daily, until they shaped lives in ways no one could fully reverse. And that is why its story doesn't end when the gates close. Prisons are designed to disappear from public consciousness. They are placed far from city centers. Hidden behind neutral language. Discussed only when something goes wrong. Millhaven followed that pattern. For most of its existence, it operated without sustained public scrutiny. The people inside it were already labeled dangerous, already convicted, already separated from society. And once someone is separated, it becomes easier to stop asking what happens next. Millhaven existed at the edge of what a system believed was necessary. It held the men who frightened other prisons. It absorbed violence that might have spread elsewhere. It promised certainty in a world that demands safety. And for a time, that promise felt reassuring. But certainty comes with a cost. Every system that relies on absolute control eventually discovers the same problem. Control works best when nothing changes. People change. Stress accumulates. Mental health erodes. Power dynamics shift. Millhaven did not fail because it lost control. It failed because it assumed control could remain static. Inside those walls, thousands of small decisions were made every day. When to open a door. How long to isolate someone. Whether to escalate or wait. Each decision seemed minor. Together, they created an environment that shaped behavior on both sides of the bars. Correctional officers did not wake up intending to harm people. Most came to work believing in order, safety, and duty. But duty inside a place like Millhaven is relentless. You do not choose when to be vigilant. You do not choose when danger appears. You respond. And when response becomes routine, reflection gets pushed aside. Inmates did not enter Millhaven as blank slates. They arrived carrying violence, trauma, and history. Some were dangerous. Some were deeply unstable. Some were both. Millhaven did not create those realities. But it interacted with them. And interaction has consequences. One of the hardest truths about Millhaven is that no single group holds all the blame. The institution did what it was designed to do. The system built it because it believed there was no alternative. The public accepted it because it promised safety. And by the time its costs became undeniable, the damage was already layered deep. Reform came, but reform is not erasure. Closing the special handling unit did not undo years of isolation. Changing language did not immediately change culture. Oversight did not instantly rebuild trust. Millhaven taught that correctional systems have memory. And memory is slow to fade. There is a temptation, when looking back, to simplify the story. To label Millhaven as cruel. Or necessary. Or outdated. But those labels miss the point. Millhaven was a response to fear. And fear is one of the strongest forces in policy making. When societies feel threatened, they prioritize control. They accept harshness. They tolerate secrecy. They postpone ethical questions. Millhaven shows what happens when those postponements stretch across decades. The men who lived inside Millhaven carried its effects forward. Some returned to society changed in ways they struggled to explain. Others never returned at all. Their stories are fragmented across court records, interviews, and reports. There is no single narrative. Only patterns. Some officers left the job early. Others stayed and adapted. Many carried invisible injuries. The system did not always have language for their experiences. Millhaven demanded emotional suppression. That demand does not vanish at the end of a shift. And then there is the public. Most people will never see inside a maximum security prison. They will never hear the sounds of metal doors closing at night. They will never feel the weight of constant surveillance. Their relationship to places like Millhaven is abstract. It exists through headlines, crime stories, and assumptions. That distance shapes tolerance. Millhaven challenges that distance. It asks whether safety should be invisible. Whether containment should be unquestioned. Whether control should be measured only by immediate outcomes. The hardest question Millhaven raises is not about prisons. It is about limits. How far is too far when dealing with danger? And who decides? Systems tend to answer that question internally. Experts consult experts. Policies cite policies. Decisions justify decisions. Millhaven shows why external scrutiny matters. Without it, control tightens quietly. There is no perfect prison. No configuration that guarantees safety without harm. But there are degrees. And Millhaven occupied an extreme one. When future crises arise, and they will, there will be pressure to return to certainty. To isolate. To lock down. To remove problems from view. Millhaven stands as a reminder of where that path leads. Not immediately. But eventually. The legacy of Millhaven is not a blueprint. It is a caution. It reminds us that systems built to contain violence must also contain restraint. That authority must be balanced by accountability. That silence is not proof of success. Even now, as this story ends, similar debates continue. In different countries. Different institutions. Different names. The language changes. The core dilemma remains. Prisons reflect the values of the societies that build them. Millhaven reflected a moment when control was prioritized above all else. Later reforms reflected a recognition of cost. Neither moment exists in isolation. They are connected. Millhaven does not ask us to sympathize blindly. It does not ask us to excuse violence. It asks us to think carefully about responses. About scale. About duration. About oversight. Because once extreme measures become normalized, they are hard to dismantle. Millhaven shows how normalization happens. Quietly. Procedurally. Incrementally. And that is why its story matters beyond Canada. Every system that faces extreme risk will be tempted by extreme control. Every society will claim necessity. Millhaven asks whether necessity should ever go unquestioned. As viewers, it is easy to watch from a distance. To consume the story and move on. But Millhaven resists that. It lingers. Because it exposes a truth that applies far beyond prison walls. Power always expands to the limits allowed. Only reflection pulls it back. The gates close. The lights dim slightly but never fully go out. Inside, life continues under rules shaped by history. Outside, debates continue under assumptions shaped by fear.